I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Jeanine Flinton, and I teach in LA Central School District. And I teach a program called Project Lead the Way to grades K through 6. And for those of you who are not familiar with Project Lead the Way, it's a student-centered, collaborative, hands-on curriculum that uses an activities project problem-based strategy, which really engages students in authentic learning.
And to follow that, I'm Lisa Ford. I teach at Queensbury High School. I teach earth science, and I think most of you are familiar with earth science. I was going to add, just because we were talking about this before we had all of you join us, for those of you not in our region, we are in the middle of a thunderstorm. So if, especially in my region, I know I am, and we have intense weather going through. So if something does seem glitchy, be aware that that's what's happening in our area. But I did notice some commentary about the feedback. So just make sure that you are muted so we don't have too much of that feedback. But if it's glitchy, it might be a little bit because of the storm.
Great, thank you. So kind of to begin our journey, there we go. We thought we would share the updated NYS timeline with everyone. So New York State Science Learning Standards are in the process of converting over to their newest standards. The old standards have been in place now for about 15 years, I think. So they've been out there, actually it's probably about 20 years now. It's been a while. So as we've been revitalizing and turning towards things that are more next generation science standards oriented, this is kind of the rollout as it currently exists, and it has changed several times as a result of the pandemic. Originally, I believe the end date was targeted at 2023, and now we're as far away as 2025. But this just gives you some idea of the scope and sequence and how they're trying to roll things out, starting with the elementary school grades, dropping tests, implementing the new testing standards, and then going all the way through high school by 2025. So this just gives you an overall scale of some of the interesting things that were happening. And the fact that we were in this transition period is one of the reasons why we kind of took up this topic. For those of you who aren't science geeks and teaching science all the time, and may not know much about NYS and next generation science standards, I thought we would just give you a little bit of an overview. The core element of next gen standards for science is this idea of three-dimensional teaching, and that teaching has these in science and engineering, and has these core elements, which are the disciplinary ideas, the practices of science and engineering, and then these cross-cutting concepts that are like the themes that hold those individual pieces together. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, how that looks is like the science and engineering practices is kind of the doing of science. The activities, the creating and development of labs, and students developing their own models, that sort of thing. The core ideas are actually the standards, the curriculum, the material that is really being studied, the stuff that's at the heart of what you would consider the content. And then these cross-cutting concepts are the things that connect them. So ideas like systems and mutuality, relationships between things, cause and effect, those sort of big picture things. So we thought this would be a good place to start to give you an idea of how this is all framed, I guess, to start. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and she's going to take you for a few slide journey.
Yeah, so sort of picking up from where Rory left off, when we got together as a group, we sort of said we want to go ahead and look at how we would implement these and how we would do that. And we had a really good group of diverse teachers from across the spectrum in terms of not only their science, math, or background, but also different levels. And of course, I want to include teachers like Jeanine, who, you know, doesn't necessarily teach those core subjects, but her subject is no less important. And so we wanted to make sure that we were focusing on everyone. And then also thinking about making sure that as we grow through and look at specific standards, that we're thinking about the level of development at all levels, from our elementary teachers through to our high school. And then really making sure that what I mean by equitable for all on that light bulb is the idea that not only is it equitable for our students and that every student can participate and there isn't kind of sort of the baggage that they bring with them that might inhibit them from learning, but also for teachers. And we'll talk more about how making sure that it's equitable for teachers led us down a variety of paths. And some of those paths are just here in the circles, talking about, we looked at gamification, we talked at inquiry-based phenomenon, and just some of the things. And we're going to go into more depth in these as we go through today. And then really working on making sure, because NGSS and NYSLIS, their main focus is really making sure that you're using real world stuff, getting the students invested in globalized problem solving. And so we really started to hone in on making sure that we were doing that so that the students and teachers would have the resources to be able to learn together as they progress through these standards. You can go ahead, Rory, and switch. And so one of the things, I think, Rory, you were going to take this back, but one of the things we necessarily looked at as we looked at the standards and the language was that the language was very similar at all of the levels. And so that was kind of a nice starting point for us. And then definitely looking at sort of specifically what are the growth steps in each of the standards from, as you see, first grade here all the way to high school, really focusing in on those standards and how to give them without feeling like we're standing at the front of the room and just giving them the data that, you know, hits those standards and those marks. So this is one that we definitely looked at the beginning of our conversation of wavelength, and it'll come up again as we look at some of the examples. We'll go ahead again.
Yeah, I was trying to, it stopped. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so just another, are we going to do the breakout? Were we going to do that?
We are not going to do the breakout because
okay.
we ran out of time in our slides.
Yeah, right. Okay, perfect. In this is just another example of another piece that we then transferred to, and you'll see again, I apologize that we're kind of front loading some stuff here, but in terms of the different standards that we looked at, and after we were kind of, for lack of a better word, almost disheartened by, we couldn't get our heads around the electromagnetic stuff, we had the conversation really, and the reason I use that word loosely is that the conversation also organically transferred, and we started talking about it more in the biological perspective of energy and matter and how that interacted. And so then we looked at those standards and compared, and again, we saw this real parallel with just some very intricate little details that changed them. And so again, it just reemphasized this idea that we could vertically plan across and find some things that we could, throughout all of our teachers in our group, really work together to start at the basis and grow a good series of activities.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, there's some interesting things that we kind of highlighted here. And it was really changing from a basic language understanding in the standards to more advanced vocabulary, but talking about the same things. So if you look at this slide, you can see where we're talking about animals need food in order to live and grow, and they obtain their food from plants and other animals. That is just very focused on things that would be familiar to kids, even at a kindergarten level. They know they get food, they know that there are plants. But if you look at the other side, they start talking about the process of photosynthesis. They start to talk about the individual components that go into that process, like carbon dioxide, water, and releasing oxygen. They talk about it at the molecular level, and they add all of that vocabulary. one of the things that was really interesting to consider is just how much vocabulary is part of this standard and this core idea when you look between these two levels. And actually, I'll go to the next slide on this too, because it talks a little bit more about the atomic level, because this is one of our big fails for the year. If you want to start to talk about this generally, or do you want me to do this part? And we'll talk about it in the next slide. Okay. So a conversation as it evolved when we started to talk about molecules was how we get younger kids to understand molecules and molecular interactions and what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. So if you look at this standard on the left-hand side, it gives you a good idea of like chemical reactions and what we're really talking about and at this level. So the key element that we were really interested is no matter what reaction or change in properties occurs, the total weight of the substances does not change. So I want you to all think about that for a moment. And when we were thinking about that, and we were thinking about the modeling that's talked about throughout the next generation standards, we posed Jeanine the question of whether or not, if we had a concrete example, I believe we were talking about third grade students at that time, Jeanine? Oh, you're muted still.
I think we were talking about that fifth grade students.
Fifth grade students. So the question we posed was, could they understand this if we had a concrete example that they could use? Because it seems simple to us. If we had a model of things that you could weigh, you should be able to see this. And so these are some of the things on the right-hand side that we thought we could use as simple tools in order for younger students to get a grip on it. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. So how this standard changed across here. From kindergarten, they were asked to understand that different kinds of matter exists. They can be any of these different states of matter, and it can be dependent on temperature. It can be described and classified by its observable properties, those sorts of things. By grade 2, different properties are suited to different purposes. So that seemed to make sense. You can't drink an ice cube, for example. So we thought that that was very accessible. And a lot of stuff can be built up from a small set of pieces. That is the first time they really start to talk about this idea that we understand at a higher level of being matter, being made up of different atoms and that sort of thing. So that becomes important as we think about it later on. By grade 5, just look at this for a minute and consider how that language starts to change. Small pieces becomes particles. We start to talk about them being too small to see. Can be detected by other ways, even if we can't see it. And then we changed the language from that previous slide where we said that no matter what, the overall mass doesn't change. Now we're actually talking about matter being conserved. So that was something we found kind of interesting. If you looked at these put together, it goes on. And if we start to look at it at different levels, we hear the word atom starts to appear here. And this is for middle school. So individual atoms are particles that can be combined to form larger particles, range in size. And then in the high school level, each atom is charged and that sort of thing. So do you guys want to talk about this part a little bit?
Actually, if you just for a moment, Roar, I just wanted to add into back to where we start talking about in kindergarten. And this is just one that I really thought was important to look how it's scaffolded and not just within the DCI and the areas within a grade level, but to see where how it was scaffolded through middle school and to high school so that those students could really investigate more complex ideas about matter, because it's hard without something tangible for students, especially at the elementary age. And I think that's what started our conversations about all the models and things as well. As Rory said, in kindergarten, we're just starting to introduce them to solid or liquid, but we're starting that conversation, that vocabulary that at least lets them explain what they're observing. And that vocabulary isn't like that separate entity anymore. It's embedded in what they're discovering, so that they start to embed it within themselves so they can use it. And by the time they get to second grade and I start with them, we're ready to start. They know what a solid is. They know what a liquid is. We're ready to start talking about the properties of matter and the conductors and insulators. And I use that terminology with them because, they've had a base and it starts to grow, and that vocabulary starts to grow. I did want to say that although things like Legos didn't work when we were looking at conservation of mass, that kind of a model did really work well for them realizing that matter is made up of small pieces, and that how those small pieces get put together determines what that matter is. And that the Legos, so they could take those Legos and build a structure. And we take a look at the structure, and then they take it apart and they use those same pieces. And I say, build a different structure. And so they know they have the same pieces, but it may look totally different. So just getting them in that mindset that's where that starts, where matter is made of smaller particles. And then again, as we move into fifth grade and they start looking at the conservation of matter and doing even experiments that even though we can't see the matter, that conservation of matter is still there. Like, for instance, taking baking soda and vinegar, and a chemical reaction occurs, but they can see if it goes up into a balloon on top of a bottle, they can see that it hasn't really vanished. It's changed its properties. It's moved from liquid into a gas, and it's still taking up space. So they start to get the sense that the total amount of matter is conserved, even though it changes its properties. So that's really where it starts to go deeper and take a deeper dive. And then again, we really have it like at the younger grades, we don't talk about molecules, just the particles. And then as they transition into middle school, that's when it gets even more complex. But again, at the younger grades, at that elementary level, we've started that conversation and started to develop that language for explaining things, explaining observations. So I just thought and said that scaffolding that we start in elementary really allows them to start looking at more complex ideas and start solving and using it, applying it to solve real world problems by the time they get to middle school and high school. So I just wanted to add that in.
No, I appreciate that very much. Also here, you'll see some of the different ideas that we tried. So there was a question about vocabulary. Since we highlighted it here, we'll mention that they ask if there's going to be a list for each grade level. And no, the standards truly don't work that way. It has to do with the way the standards are set up. It's actually more about the general conceptual understandings. Now, unfortunately, this has been a shortcoming of standards for a while, that vocabulary as needed, let's say, to pass a test, does not necessarily have a vocabulary list. They do have, there's a note there from Lisa, they do have suggested ideas, terminology that's important. Essentially, they have the terminology that they use as part of the questioning that they're using for exams and some of the larger conceptual ideas, but not a vocabulary list per se, which is kind of weird. So the question about why the Legos didn't work for the conservation of mass. Anybody want to guess what it was before we spill the beans, as it were? So when we started to do something even fairly simple, Anything that was beyond, let's say, 3 atoms large wouldn't stay together well enough to have it be coherent enough for students to do anything with before they manipulated it. Also, even between the smaller and larger blocks of Legos, unless you used really, really big ones, which became a problem, we couldn't get enough of a mass difference between subtle characteristics in the molecules to have a meaning. So essentially, even if you used a different size block for something like oxygen and carbon, it was very difficult to get a clear, accurate reading on most scales that people could afford to buy between, let's say, carbon dioxide and I'm trying to think what the other example was that we used, nitrous oxide, let's say. So when you're dealing with things that were similar, it was very different to get discrete numbers separated from them. So that was the problem with the Legos. All of those other things that we tried, the pastas we thought were going to be a great idea. And we started trying to weigh different types of pasta, and it turns out that they all almost weigh the same, which was a real problem. The beans were similar, and we finally got to the point, I think the largest beans that we had that were normal beans that would be readily available would just register as a single bean on a food scale. I think Lisa did that as part of our meeting when I was explaining to them why all the other things didn't work out.
Yeah, there's actually a question about using mega blocks. So I'm doing exactly what I did in our meeting right now, is I'm grabbing my scale, which is a typical like scale that someone would have. And I just conveniently have my son's mega blocks, super handy. So I'm just going to, which is what I did when we were in our meeting, is I was running around literally in my kitchen, testing beans and pasta to see if they would go on a typical sort of scale that you might have in your classroom. So I'm going to take the smallest one mega block, and I've just zeroed out. And in grams, it actually would register. Let's see if a bigger one, it might be a good suggestion. There you go. I'll use a, where's my 2? Sorry for the feedback sound of me rummaging through the mega blocks package.
We appreciate the real-time data collection.
So I will just say, in terms of, funny that, I mean, the mega blocks were in the same spot. So in terms of grams for the single, it was 8 grams, and a double was 16 grams. So it actually was double the gram weight. So it's an interesting turn of events. It just would, then you'd have to take that to, how does that equate to, now I'm building.
Right. And as a size perspective, how many mega blocks could you fit on a food scale?
How many mega blocks would I be able to fit there individually, side by side? If I had the 4, let me see if I have a 4 handy. I do. So I have 4, a 3, 2, and a 1. So this is what I am sort of doing, so that you can kind of see I have the single underneath. So I can do 3 rows of 4 pieces across. So basically 12 pieces, whether that's a single, double, triple, or a quad. So you'd be able to get up to 12.
Nice. So that is something that would work, at least in a small system.
Yes, in a very small system, yeah.
I did take some time looking at scales that were more sensitive, and they were quite pricey. When we got to scales capable of distinguishing easily with real good numbers, like between things the sizes like smaller beans and even paper with Petri dishes, the scale prices were in the thousands rather than even hundreds of dollars, which is something that we were really concerned about, you know, to need a tool that was that expensive. One of the suggestions that came up in one of our later meetings was we couldn't figure out why companies don't make weighted molecular modeling balls. You've probably all seen those little molecular modeling balls where you have the little sticks that make bonding happen. And we were wondering why they weren't weighted differently so that you could teach this with that. So that became one of those, restricting factors that, the tool wasn't out there to easily make this available to you at a fair and inexpensive price. So we became interested in a whole bunch of other things. Do you guys want to talk about what we were talking about? Because I know I'm supposed to be talking at the next slide too. I feel like I'm talking all the time.
You're absolutely fine. I can certainly handle this bit. So yeah, so as we it was like, as I said earlier, sort of the organic transitions as we hit roadblocks that we're like, okay, we can't get scales. And then, there's the suggestion of, okay, especially in today's environment and culture of learning, a lot of us have been strategizing to find simulations and stuff, and we started to look for simulations that might be able to fill the gap of being able to measure these smaller items. And then that really led us down this different path of really looking at gaming in general. And at the time, we sort of naturally transitioned to a different topic, and we went into more living environment standards. And a lot of times it was, I'll call Jeanine on this. It was Jeanine. We would go to her and go, okay, what are you teaching right now to your young kids that we can kind of grow and inspect? And she'd say, well, I'm teaching ecosystems, interaction between. So we would be like, okay, so for next meeting, we're going to come with some ideas of games that would work for that. So we kind of moved through that, wondering about how, if we could find some that we could create. And we actually spent an entire meeting thinking about games that we could create and ones that we had played and how to transition those into games that we could use in the classroom. And it was kind of like, are there ones already out there that are feasible? And so we went to the next meeting with all these ideas, and then we had real-time testing with some young people. We're very fortunate that Rory has a big contingent of kids at his disposal to test on. And so we then had that data to move forward with. And I think that actually leads us into the next piece.
Yeah.
Right. And that was like what Lisa said, just having the kids test them, because I did go on to some of the games that we initially researched, and my perspective was totally different than the kids' perspective. So it was really good to get a real life testers to try them out.
We can call them guinea pigs. It's okay. I give you permission. So here's what we did. Jeanine especially had explored a whole bunch of games that she had found interesting and found some different sites, and we all went in different directions, and we came back with sites, and we were trying to test them real time during one of our meetings and looking at them, and we found that we weren't really very good at many of them. They weren't always very intuitive to us, but it turns out my grandkids, actually, it was very intuitive for them. So I'll tell you about our testers first. They were, at the time they did this, they were 7, 8, almost 9, and 9, almost 10. So we went to one of the sites, which was Plum Landing, and they have a bunch of games on Plum Landing, which is part of PBS. So I just have this one here to show you an example of kind of what the cover looks like, and this was actually one of the games that they did play around with. See how the web page is set up. You'll actually see where it shows like a curriculum topic. This was for biodiversity and ecosystems, the type of activity it would be, and then there is actually a drop-down menu that shows you the standards, which was really cool. On their websites, they tout that they give you the questions to ask. They give you this set of them. Here's an example from there. What was the most awesome animal you saw in the rainforest? What was the coolest plant? Why? Which mission was your favorite and why? How do animals in your neighborhood communicate? Again, bringing it back to a localized personal experience, things that are relevant to the kids' lives, which becomes really important. How do the plants in your neighborhood attract insects? These types of things are really great questions. So you would think that, hey, this sounds like a really cool thing that would really work, right? So here's what really happened. The game was a little deceptive. If you go back, and I will just go back to that screen, I want you to pay attention to that picture on the cover from the game. So you have animals and insects flying around in the background, and you have this jungle explorer that has this goggle type thing on their face, and that goggle thing is a camera. So the kids were asked to find 5 different animals and take pictures of them, which was very simple. The problem was that, for example, a bird would be flying by and they would go to try to take a picture of it and they would miss. And the game would still say, oh, congratulations, you found a, and the founder was a small blip on a leaf way in the background of the photograph that they brought forward and told you something about. So now the kids, when they were playing the game, really were not catching always the pictures they were trying to catch. They weren't really finding the animals. They were getting credit for finding animals. And then they would give them this whole blurb about what role that organism plays in the atmosphere and that sort of thing. And the problem was that the kids who it was supposed to be age appropriate for, which was 3 through 5 fifth grades, became really bored quickly. My grandson, who was 7, just barely at the time, was the only one that played it for any length of time, and the content was above what he could understand. And he never even heard most of it, because as soon as he got the picture of one, he was clicking to get the next photo. The content was gone. He never even saw it. So that was the problem with that. So we said, okay, what about more advanced games? Because part of the earth science stuff, we were talking about climate and weather, and this topic always seemed to come up. So this was from the Smithsonian Science Education Center. Target audience was 6th, 7th, and 8th, so middle school grades, earth and space science. And if you look at that screen, you see that there's a lot going on there. So this game was really, really, really cool. I could have played this game for hours. Had some really great elements built into it. One, there was a great storyline. You were just hired as a person working for this small city, and you're their disaster protection preparedness person. And you get a budget, and the better you do, you get more money for your budget. And things happen all the time to this poor small city. This is not a place any of you would want to live. They have earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and flooding, tsunami class rainfall. I mean, this is just a horrible place to have this job, right? You do not want this job in this city. Pay attention just briefly there to some of the stuff on that photo in the screen. This is actually from the beginning of the game. So there's an anemometer, there's a thermometer, there's a barometer, a seismometer. All of this equipment is built in there for these 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Now, if you think back to those standard slides that we showed you a while ago, it was really that 5, 6, 7, and 8, when they're starting to share that the more intense content vocabulary words with students. And what you see here is they're using quite a few fairly complicated and advanced words to describe the instrumentation here. The kids who were playing it, that were the 9s and 10-year-olds here, they were pretty excited about the game, but they could not figure out how to win. Because with kids, games are about winning. In this game, the only way to win is to make good decisions. We got as far as we built a couple of hurricane shelters, and they got a little bit more of a budget, and they moved on from there. So that was a thing. So the game was very complicated. It was complicated enough that the 7-year-old was not even really interested in playing it because it didn't make any sense. The graphics were cool, the topics were cool, it was very engaging, but they couldn't understand the vocabulary. I have a feeling, had we moved forward with this, we would have found that most games, they're underestimating the amount of interest they need to generate for kids at that grade level. So basically, if you're looking at a game that's targeted for 5, 6, 7th, and 8th grades, that's probably going to be interesting for a 2nd, 3rd, maybe 4th grader if it's really high end. But for the most part, the people developing the games are not hitting their target audience. So I know you're probably wondering how all of this aligns with the vertical alignment of the New York State standards. And really, this were just part of our journey. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeanine, and we're going to talk about what that led us to a conversation about teaching about hurricanes in the classroom. And
yeah, so when we started to venture down this road and look at this DCI, actually Lisa and I got talking, and we were talking about how some of the things that I do in the classroom through Project Lead the Way is I use an erosion tray. And students are gathering information about hurricanes and what effects they will have, like what's, and they have to develop, they're posed with a scenario of what a hurricane will, how it will affect an area and how to prevent damage to, homes and just different facilities. So through Project Lead the Way in second grade, we actually start talking about Earth systems and what forces cause erosion, what cause erosion to occur quickly or what cause erosion to occur slowly. And so again, starting that conversation and using that terminology for them to start thinking about how it affects our Earth and the fact that our Earth is always changing. So we started talking about this and realized that we were already starting to use some of the same activities to build knowledge, and looking from where it starts in second grade, talking about erosion, then moving on to third grade. They're going to design a solution that reduces the impact of weather-related hazards. And then also looking at how we used to teach weather and climate and where we're moving towards. So Rory, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so in the past, we've kind of looked at weather lecture styles, standard, paper activities. And as we're moving through in the present, through Project Lead the Way, even in second grade, we started gathering, analyzing weather data, analyzing hurricane paths that already have been documented. And then I had them design a structure that's able to withstand hurricane forces. And, they actually built a model and we evaluated, we worked all the way through the engineering design process for them to do this. And so it was really hands-on, and they gained both the vocabulary, and they could really make observations of how a hurricane would affect a certain area. But still looking through, after kind of talking about the DCI and the three-dimensional learning and the progression, and through our conversations during our meetings, we started talking about, well, where do we even want to take this even further? So we were able to go to a presentation on Mesonet, which allows us to gather relevant and live weather data. And so they can relate it. You can go and get data for your area. You can look over at trends of weather data so that they can really start forming, looking at patterns and bringing that into their discussions, and ultimately to make predictions. And then again, bringing in, starting to look at what's causing like these trends to happen. We're seeing, we started to talk about how we're seeing hurricanes at the time of the year that it's not normal hurricane season. And so starting that discussion, what's causing that? Climate change, what's going on in all of our Earth's systems that affect that. And also bringing in the human impact of disaster response. And again, we went back to looking at some of those games like Rory just showed you, the natural disaster preparedness games, bringing that into our learning for students and having them do some hands-on, seeing the impact of just, when communities are preparing for natural disasters or reacting to natural disasters, bringing in bottled water. What impact does that have on the future of the environment? So just leading, we've already started to look to do that three-dimensional learning, but even in taking it further. And Rory, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. And just again, this is more of a visual. So the first part of the slide is, previously, just talking about the types of precipitation, reading a document, having them do worksite type materials. That was the past. The center one is more the present. They're collecting their own data. They're analyzing the track of a hurricane, Hurricane Sandy. They're looking at like weather data and putting it into charts and analyzing it. And then you can see that, that is an example of what they were doing. They created a structure that would resist or reduce the impact of hurricane, the flooding and winds. And they evaluated it. They went to see if it would really work. So they went all the way through the engineering design process to solve a real world problem, which really makes it authentic to them. And then looking at that third section, moving just to looking at more climate change, what's causing these natural disasters, starting to let them track the hurricanes, and really get a sense, and even that we live in upstate New York, why are we concerned about hurricanes? What effect does it have on us? And we look at, data from our weather data from Mesonet, look at the flooding that occurred and look at the precipitation that occurred during a certain time frame, and starting to really analyze things that are affecting them in real life. So, and then Lisa can kind of take you through where.
One forward. There we go. So we have the same sort of standard at the. You're going to dump those right now. So the makeup blacks are about to go down, so I apologize right now for that. We have sort of a similar standard. Ours is looking at a little bit more how we communicate and look at the data to analyze it sort of in the moment to give warnings and go with that along with building and understanding the science. So, or if you want to just pop ahead. So we have very similar, the past, it was just sort of lecture note style, paper labs, those standard things. Right now, what I do or have done in my class is a little different this year, but looking at doing some just sort of general looking at extreme weather, have students do a project, and then we do a gallery walk of the informations. And again, that was a little different this year, but hoping, of course, to get back to regular next year, but I'm hoping, of course, next year will be different anyway. But and then investigating the past of hurricanes over sort of historical data. NASA has a great resource for that, and you can get all the data for the past hurricanes and be able to track them and graph them and do that information so students can do that. But what I'd really like to, and I think through our conversation here in this group, is that again, looking at the same sort of stuff, is really looking at the Mesonet data, looking at how does that impact different communities, how do landforms come into play with, even funneling in the rain. I know in this area, in upstate New York area, we had a few years ago when Irene hit, we didn't necessarily get the impact of the hurricane, but we got the very strong rains from it. And even a house that I was living in a few years ago, the back area was washed out and had not recovered from it. So it's not that students can't have had an impact from that. We also had an earthquake last year. So, you can use local events that are atypical and still talk about how that affects the students' own lives and really look at that. And then for the high school, the idea is that you then build in that real world, like how would you then talk about this with your community. What are some issues that you might have to work at, creating better models, creating better instruments to record the information, giving better warning systems, better evacuation routes, that sort of thing. So we're really taking it to that engineering side by actually developing stuff. And if you go ahead, Rory, I have the picture slide as well, just to give some graphics for this. So yes. So, sort of the standard paper lab, I have the students doing the gallery walk there in the center with kind of the information. And I apologize, it's really small, but right down in the center, you can see the types of colored models you can get from NASA that show every year. You can have the students develop those, but you can also have, they have some great graphics that show the paths of all the hurricanes. And so just to get an overview of, all the hurricanes tend to, south of 30, they go towards the United States. At 30, they switch back. So just those good visuals to really discuss, why does that happen? Why do these storms go the way they do? And then in the final column, really starting to pinpoint and discuss more, instead of being an overview of all of sort of natural disasters, extreme weather events, is really getting pinpointing into the data. And I spent a good chunk of time down a rabbit hole of watching storm chasers and learning more about tornadoes and myself. And so that I could talk to students about, what is it really, the weather phenomenon that is happening there. And Channel 4 in Oklahoma has great resources for that, just as a side note. They have a whole storm tracker team that does that. And they have a lot of good discussion about the Oklahoma more tornadoes from 2013 as well, and the devastation that happened there. But that was an aside, so I apologize. But here in the center, where the little sort of target is what the Mesnet data looks like. So it's just a spreadsheet of information, the day, the time, all the weather data you could possibly think of. And so when if you do request some, and you can request a specific amount, you can request a certain, like I asked for the last 4 years, 2017 to present. So I've got a lot of files. You get all these files and they're all zipped, and then you can go through them. So there's a ton of information there that, as a teacher, you can either sort through it, or you can have the students sort through it and pick out, how does air pressure affect, does wind speed affect? All of this data is there, which is really a great resource that we have at our disposal. And then taking that to the next level of the climate and creating better, as I said, warning systems and evacuation routes. And actually, the picture there that says Earth on it, that was actually a project that I developed this year that students finished a couple weeks ago now, and just some really great, my students figured out that, like, the Philippines has no evacuation route for tsunamis and other events. Like if they have an explosive volcanic eruption, they have no evacuation plan that's really feasible. And so the students were trying to figure out how to better help those people in the Philippines so that we could save lives. And that was really just, the students picked the Philippines and they were like, there's no evacuation route. How do we do the project? I was like, that's the point, is you create one for these, save these people, because you've discovered that is an area that can be affected. And in this case, it wasn't hurricanes. They were doing dynamic earth, but it's still them figuring out that they might have, they can help these people even though we're worlds away, and that whatever things they come up with to help the Philippines could help our folks on the East Coast for hurricanes, or they might affect the West Coast. And we did talk about how tsunamis and things like that could affect both of our coasts and things like that. So just kept moving forward, but I do want to keep moving forward with the slides as well.
Yeah. So, but one interesting thing came out of this is that they didn't really necessarily hit on this directly, but when we were talking about the hurricanes in particular, it turned out that Lisa and Jeanine were using the exact same resource in two different ways. And the big difference between what was happening in the late elementary grades and the high school grades was only that Jeanine was basically sending them to the site to get the bringing the site information to the students, and Lisa was having them get it themselves, which is one of the ways we wound up actually kind of starting to think about this. Well, what is the real benefit going to be of NYSLIS as we move forward, and what other topics might be like that? So Jeanine, do you want to talk about these kids and what they're doing? We have about 4 minutes left, so.
So sure, thinking about the progression, the scaffolding of information over multiple years. So we think about talking about to kindergartners about weather. They check the weather every day. And then moving on to this, which is second grade. This is a Project Lead the Way project where they take a look at what forces are changing our Earth, and they're posed with a problem of preventing a landslide. So they're applying their knowledge, they scaffold through activities and a project, and then they apply it to a real world problem. So this is second grade, and they have developed their solution to preventing a landslide. And then again, we work through the engineering design process to where they actually evaluate it. And then they always end up thinking, well, even if it didn't work, how could I improve it? So this is second grade, thinking on to third grade, where they're starting to take real data and look at it and analyze it, and then make claims about how they could help reduce impact of things like hurricanes. So they're taking it up and scaffolding more. And then Rory, if you want to go to the next one.
Lisa, do you want to tell us about these guys?
Yeah, so really interesting. What we discovered was that basically Jeanine and I are doing the exact same thing. Our materials might look slightly different, but my students in the high school are looking at erosion and water and how it affects landforms. And one of the things that came out of that is the idea that right now it's okay that our two groups are basically doing the exact same thing, because my students that I currently have didn't get that education because the standards weren't that way. But now what's going to happen, as you saw at the very beginning, as NYSLIS moves into play, is that Jeanine's students at the lower levels, when they get to me, I'm no longer going to have to just do the exact same lab because they've already got that basis. So my students are forced to do a lot because they have to learn that material and then progress with it. Whereas the idea is that in future, and with a properly vertically planned curriculum, Jeanine will do that introduction, and then my students will be developing and testing kind of the real world, like, why did this fail? My students always ask, like, why did New Orleans got flooded because it was below the Gulf? And it's like, no, you need to look at what is the system that failed. It was the levees that failed. And, it just brings that back to, how do we real world problem solve? We can't build those levees back exactly how they were. And so here's some students that are testing out some stuff to see if water movement will hold. You can see that one of the students has to hold it because it's going to fall over. And so they're trying to work around by, okay, we need more pressure on this. So they're trying to develop those systems for real world situations.
So why, right? Why do we have these new standards? So these are just some little pieces that I threw in here to give everyone a sense of kind of why these things are important. The idea is that kids get more, better, significant foundational knowledge, consistent experiences for students across all grade levels. As most of you know, the science standards across our whole country, honestly, for lower grade levels have been really weak for decades. This at least gives us some common starting ground where we can start to develop understanding. Hopefully that leads to less remediation and more new learning and more relevant learning as we make more connections to the kids' lives. So all of that happening simultaneously. And that is where we are. Next thing I think we have here is a resource page, and I know that there's some stuff entering into the chat room, and I know our time is pretty much up. Let's just look through here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, it's all thank you. I love this. How simple is that? Anybody have any questions for us? I'll leave this screen here in case you want to just screenshot it for now. And I do want to thank you all for being here. All right. going to go to the next slide here, and this just has the contact information for Lisa and Jeanine if you need to reach out to them about anything. And if there are no other questions, I will stop sharing here. Yeah, and thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it. And if you need us, you know where to find us. So have a great afternoon. Enjoy the crazy weather. And hopefully we'll see you in another meeting real soon.